Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Small Business Insider Live, the live stream program hosted by the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. My name is Christy Arslan, and I am SB Council's Entrepreneur in Residence, and I am also a small business owner from Alexandria, Virginia. SB Council is a membership organization that advocates for small businesses in Washington, D.C., and really works hard to make sure that your issues are championed and that you have a voice when it comes to different types of policy, whether it be healthcare, regulatory issues, taxes, anything you can think of. We want to make sure that there's a small business voice. We have joining us today our chief economist, Ray Keating. Ray is our in-house expert on almost everything. So he writes a lot of content on the economy, on key issues like taxes and intellectual property and trade. He is the author of many books and also of our recent gap analysis series. So definitely take a look at sbcouncil.org to see some of the great content that Ray puts out, just trying to educate all of you and policymakers on small businesses and the impact they're having on our economy. Ray, thanks so much for joining us.
Great being here, Christy. How are you?
I'm doing well. We have a lovely day here. I know you're in the New York area, so I'm assuming we have similar weather.
It's nice. Tax burden is very heavy, but everything else is very nice.
Exactly. It's tax time. That's right. Yes, we were feeling the pain as well, trying to pull together everything for tax time. Today, we want to talk a little bit about the economy. We are rounding out President Trump's 100 days coming up pretty soon. And we also are finishing up the first quarter of 2017. So we'd love to get some insight from you about how things are going with our economy and jobs.
Yeah, it's still a mixed story. You can't turn a ship around on a dime, if you will. So when you look at the various numbers that are around, it's a mixed tale, and that's what we've seen for a long time. This recovery's been an underperforming recovery, averaging about a little over 2% growth. To put that in perspective, we should be growing during a recovery expansion period about double that. We should be over 4%. So that's why everybody's been down in the dumps about this recovery. The last year's economic growth for 2016 was only 1.6%, which was tied 2011 for the worst year during this recovery. So we have some real challenges, to say the least. The early numbers for 2017, as I said, are kind of mixed. The jobs numbers, I think if you saw the headline story with the most recent jobs for March, a lot of people were down in the dumps about it, because you have to understand, with jobs, there are actually two surveys. The government never makes things easy, okay? So there are two surveys. There's an establishment payroll survey, and that's where we only saw about, I think it was 98,000 jobs created. Expectations were up around 250,000. Mm-hmm. But there's another survey, the household survey, which is actually where we get the unemployment rate from. And that survey I like because it tends to capture startup and small business activity better than the payroll survey. Okay. And that showed a big jump in jobs, 472,000, I believe, per month. The employment population ratio, the share of people employed, increased. The labor force increased. Those are all things that we've seen over these last several years real problems with, very, very low levels of employment and labor force participation. Now, they're still low, but at least at the start of 2017, they're moving in the right direction. So there was some good news there. There were other stories that were positive. Manufacturing production is an area that I keep an eye on, an important part of the economy. And that was up for the first, the early numbers for 2017 showed growth there. Now, that's important because for the last 4 years, really, manufacturing has not done well in terms of production levels. And we're actually still below. This is really depressing. This is pluses and minuses here. Manufacturing production today is still below the pre-recession high. So we haven't gotten back to where things were back in 2007. So, but there's some, as I said, some growth early this year. The consumer consumer confidence levels are good. Consumer credit numbers were actually pretty strong early this year, so those are some positives. But there are other things that balance it out, unfortunately, on the negative side. One of the reasons why this economy has been so slow growth is because of a lack of strong growth in private investment, business investment. And actually, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but in this past year, 2016, non-residential investment, which is essentially business investment, actually declined for the first time since the recession. So, so those are some issues there. And unfortunately, the early numbers that were, the numbers we use to figure out what's going on in the GDP for the first quarter were not exactly robust. There was basically flat. So there's some concerns that continue there. Other areas, income, disposable income, that's the number I always look at because that's essentially after-tax income. That's the money that people have to spend or save, invest. So we're flat early in 2017 there as well. So it's a lot of pluses and minuses in this type of economy, and that unfortunately is continuing so far.
Well, I know you've seen a number of reports that have indicated that there's definitely higher optimism among small business owners. Do you think like that, that optimism about where the economy is going to go is helping with some of the job growth? Yeah,
I think that's true. I think that optimism number is critical. You want optimistic small business owners and entrepreneurs. They should be optimistic, and the fact that they haven't for so long obviously has been quite troubling. So I do think that that's reflected in those jobs numbers that we saw, but still there are questions on the investment front. And I think that goes to, they're still at a stage where they have real expectations that policy in Washington is going to change in a positive direction. You and I have talked about this before. So the expectations are there, but you have to actually carry through on it. So I think there is, on the investment side at least, kind of still keeping our powder dry until we actually see tax reform, until we see, real repeal and reform on the Obamacare front, until we see regulatory relief. So I think they're overall positive about, the direction that we're hearing things are going in. And there certainly have been some positive things coming out of the White House in terms of executive orders on the regulatory front and things like that. But in terms of the big issues, they're, like all of us, they're kind of waiting to see what happens.
Sure. So, you started talking about some of the things that need to get done to create a more economic, favorable environment. What other things, to continue to move the economy in the right direction? What other things can Congress or the Trump administration do to get the economy flowing even more and those job numbers up, or investment, in fact?
Yeah, and that's, remember that we're talking small business, and we know the importance of small businesses to the economy in terms of job creation, economic growth, innovation, all those things that we want. So that investment number ties into the entrepreneurship, the levels of entrepreneurship. And you mentioned before that we did a gap series last year leading up to the election. And one of those was we looked at the state of entrepreneurship. And the numbers there were not good. There were declines, unfortunately, across the board in terms of the number of employers, non-employers, the Department of Labor, self-employed numbers. They were all very troubling, and they've been troubling for a while. So that's, I think, a critical focus on the policy front is how do we get entrepreneurship really moving again? It's not about government handouts or government trying to pick winners and losers, because quite frankly, they're not very good at that. It's about creating an environment where entrepreneurship can flourish. And just one other number to throw in here, I don't want to jump around too much, but the latest numbers that came out from the Department of Labor, they tell us those self-employed numbers. And unfortunately, when you look at the latest self-employed data, it's not good. We're actually down from where we were a year ago in terms of unincorporated self-employed. We're down from late last year. And this has been a long-term trend, really, that started I want to say I don't have the numbers in front of me, but somewhere around 2006, 2007. So, we hit a high around there, and we're not anywhere close to getting back to that. So, again, that's critical. So, what can be done on the policy front? Well, all these things we've been talking about, tax reform, regulatory relief, are all positives. Just very quickly on the regulatory side, nobody should be surprised that increased regulatory costs hit small business hardest, right? It's no matter how you want to calculate it, studies have been done to confirm it, but small businesses certainly get hit the hardest. Also, startups and whether people are going to take the dive into the entrepreneurial waters, if you will, those are affected negatively by increased regulatory costs. So any kind of regulatory relief and reform, I think, is critical. On the tax side, obviously getting rates down, but obviously the corporate side, we've heard a lot about that, and that's important. And the bulk of C corporations that pay the corporate income tax are small, mid-sized companies. But we also have to understand that I think the latest numbers I figured out from IRS data is about 94% of businesses pay the personal income tax. That's again overwhelmingly small businesses. Sole proprietorships, partnerships, LLCs, S corps, etc. So we can't ignore that side when we're looking at getting rates down and providing relief. And things like capital gains taxes, small business owners understand how difficult it is to get capital. And you want to have the best environment possible where investors are going to be willing to take these enormous risks. So I think the ideal scenario in tax reform would be to eliminate the capital gains tax. But at the very least, we need to get the rate down in a major way. So and start indexing gains for inflation and things like that. So I think those are some areas that we definitely need to be concentrating on when we're moving ahead on tax reform.
So, right, we heard in the news about the upcoming cuts in the government. So, this administration is really looking at being what they can do to streamline agencies and costs, which will, at the end of the day, help our deficit and our spending. But what impact will that have on the economy? I know the federal government's a big purchaser of goods and services, through their contracting efforts. And so will this have any impact? How might scaling down the federal government have, what impact might that be on the economy?
Right. There's two schools of thought, right? There's the Keynesian school of economic thought, of which I am not part of, who look at government as being kind of a stimulus for economic growth. There are folks like myself that are on the free market end of things that look at those resources, because those resources that government spends, they come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. Whether it's through taxes or through borrowing, it's getting siphoned away from the private sector. So that's, I think, what we need to understand. And once you kind of get your head around that, then you start saying, okay, maybe we should be looking at where can we rein in the size of government so we can leave resources in the private sector, because they're going to be used more productively there. It doesn't mean that everybody in the private sector makes the right decision, right? But the great thing about the private sector is when you make a bad decision, you get punished and resources are reallocated to somebody else. I always tell my when I was teaching MBA students, the difference between that and government is when you make a bad decision in government and you spend money, they don't take those resources away. They tend to give you more money. So failure is kind of rewarded. But so I think that's the critical thing to understand. But then there's also, obviously legitimate things that government does, right, and needs to do. So the question there is, how do we get savings? And listen, any way that we can be reviewing spending programs and cutting out waste and cutting out entire programs that don't make any sense, that the private sector can do better. But also, competitive contracting, this is where entrepreneurs can come in, and they do come in, right? Where can we, this is something a government has to do or has to fund, but can the private sector help us out here? Can we contract out and get a firm to do this in a more efficient way? Can we look at, the entrepreneurial sector and look to them to solve some problems that, quite frankly, government bureaucrats haven't been able to figure out? So that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity, even in an environment like this, where if the Trump administration is serious about reining in spending, which I applaud, if that's the case, I'm behind it. But you can find savings in all kinds of ways. Sometimes you need to use the meat axe, but other times you need to look to the private sector to say, can you do this more efficiently? Can you come up with some new ideas and innovations where we can provide these services but at a lower cost?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any particular areas that people should be keeping an eye out if they want to really monitor how the economy is doing? What numbers should they look for? What reports should they monitor so they can get a little bit of insight on how things are going?
Yeah, well, the big number is the GDP number, right? So at the end of April, we'll get the first look at GDP for, how is the economy growing overall for the first quarter of this year. So that always gets big attention, and deservedly so. And you need to, hopefully we at SBE Council do an analysis that gets you below the top line as well. Tells you about what's going on with, how do consumers look in this, and how does private investment look, and what's going on the trade front. Are we, we've had some real difficulties exporting lately. Recent years, we have not seen the export growth that we need. What's going on that front? So there are a whole host of numbers to look at there. I also, I mentioned manufacturing before. I always look at the industrial production numbers that come out. And mid to late April, maybe next week, depending on, I can never remember the date exactly, but those are some numbers in there to see what's going on in the industrial sector of the economy: manufacturing, mining, utilities, and you can get some information there as well. So those are two off the top of my head that are coming that are definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Well, Ray, thanks so much for this insight. Really appreciate your insight on what's going on with the economy as we round out the first 100 days with President Trump. And we'll be sure to check in with you at the end of the second quarter with how things are going. And hopefully we'll see some movement on tax reform. I know all small businesses, especially this time of year, are really wishing for that tax reform.
The key really is, if we get these policies right in Washington for a change, we'll see some real benefits in the private sector, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I couldn't agree more. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today in this edition of Small Business Insider Live, hosted by SBE Council. We encourage you to stay up to date with SBE Council by visiting our website, sbecouncil.org, and signing up for our e-news. You can get that free and clear right to your inbox so you can know what's going on that's impacting small business or what's coming down the pike. You can also engage with us on social media. We're on Twitter at SB Council, or join us on our Facebook page as well. We host Small Business Insider Live every week, every Thursday at 1:30. So check us out every Thursday to get some new information on small business issues, policy items, as well as tools and tips you can use to help start and grow your business. Ray, thank you again so much for your time, and everybody have a wonderful weekend.